I get the wireless mic, so I get to stand up and dance, I guess, you know. I'm not going to do the standard resume, you know, here's the resume of Betty Adcock, here's the resume of Shelby Stevenson, here's your resume of Jackie Sheldon Green. You can always read the back of the books and get that. What I would like to do here is have an informal discussion. These are 3 people who were inducted into the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame as poets this year. And I'd like to have a discussion. I have some questions, but if you have any questions from the audience, raise your hand, and I might or might not recognize you. I will try to. But the first question I basically want to throw out is, how did you become a poet? You know, what was it that, why are you a poet and not a mechanic, or not a housewife, or not an airline pilot? Why are you a poet? What started you on this road that brought you here?
Are you addressing this to me?
Yes, I am now.
All right. All right. Well, let's see. I guess I was a housewife. The first review of the book.
Can you talk into the mic?
Sorry.
Sorry. You can bring it closer to you, too. You can just move it and hold it, or.
Okay. I'm going to try to get this so it doesn't hit the whatever. Here we are. My purse is on the cord. That's the problem. All right. There. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I was a housewife. The first book I ever published was with LSU Press, where I'm still publishing too when I'm not with JCAR. I had a book reviewed in the Fayetteville newspaper, I believe it was. It was a newspaper in North Carolina. And the headline was, Raleigh Housewife Writes Book of Poetry. That's something to remember, isn't it?
That's the arts.
But that's the male establishment. But you would certainly never have, I don't know, you would never have owner of hardware store writes book of poetry or whatever. But anyway, I started writing poetry when I was very, very young. I mean, playing with words was always important to me. My mother died when I was 6, which a lot of you know. That was terribly traumatic. It involved uprooting. It involved leaving a house that was beloved to me, going to live with an aunt with my father, and losing pets, house, orchards, my flock of chickens, all kinds of things. And so I was kind of a mess, and I think sometimes that makes you introspective if you have losses early, and so that probably happened. But I always loved to read, and it turned out, after I was grown, I learned that my mother, I knew she was an English literature and Latin teacher. What I didn't know, in the high school, in my little town, what I didn't know was that she had started a study club, and that she was having the locals of the town, 2,000 people, she was having these women, storekeepers' wives, doctors' wives, ministers' wives, reading the poems of T.S. Eliot, the poems of Walt Whitman. She was a pretty good critic. She said that Whitman was the innovator, the real visionary, and that Sandburg was only a follower. I have her notes, which were given to me by my father when I was almost 25 and was already writing really heavily myself. So I really didn't know this about her until I was grown. I think that's another reason I think I had a ghost on my shoulder.
Okay, let me just, I want to follow up a little bit. You mentioned your mother dying when you were 6. And it was very traumatic, and not just because of your mother's death, but leaving your pets and stuff. And I'm reminded of the Mahmoud Darwish poem, the very famous Palestinian poet, who talked about when his territory was divided and the Palestinian land given away. He was a young child.
You got
Hello.
to put it next to you.
Okay, Mahmoud Darwish was a young child when he lost, overnight, he lost the place he lived. And he's got this very moving poem about the horse, asking his father, what are we going to do about the horse? The horse needs us. And the father was trying to basically lie. But he didn't want the son to know that, I can't take the horse. It's like, well, the horse is going to stay and take care of the house. And of course, even as a young child, Darwish knew that wasn't true. So I wonder if that trauma of losing not just the mother, but also all these other creatures somehow spurred you towards a sensibility that will allow you to look at the world poetically.
I think it makes you sensitive, something like that. And I think poets are sensitive people. I think we feel a lot. It seems to be, but there are all kinds of reasons. And I also think that sometimes you're born with an affinity for words. Certainly, I believe my mother was, and she grew up in a very, very poor family, the oldest of 9 children. So she put herself through college in the 1920s. Not easy. So anyway, I know that there was something, and who knows why, but I know that as soon as I could print, I started writing little things that rhymed, because I loved rhymes and I loved the way the Bible sounded and that kind of thing. So the first poem I ever wrote, my aunt she kept it, and it's about Easter lilies growing by the road, which is very strange since they don't. They grow in florist shops. Anyway.
Okay, now, Shelby, your father didn't necessarily want you to become a poet, is that correct?
He never said he didn't, or he did. He never said he did either. He never used the word, as I remember. I was just there.
And what was his expectation, if you had to imagine your father's expectation of how your life trajectory was going to unfold?
Ride the hog home and come back home and stay here and go hunt and fish. But he didn't mind once I went away. And no, there was never any comment about that from my mother either. So I might have been self-taught, Richard, I'm not sure, looking back. Because we didn't have books in the house, certainly. We had dogs. I've told this story, Betty knows. Dogs don't talk, but they make a beautiful noise. And anyway, when I was about 25, I came to books with a vengeance, and I read them. And they were all personal to me. And that's basically my story. And then when I was 35, I published a poem sent one out when I was 34. Davidson Miscellany brought it out. So you fill in the blank. It was called Whales Are Hard to See. I must have been reading Melville. But after that, I never could revise that poem. I turned to what I never thought I could turn to when I was growing up. The hogs. I had a Duroc 4-H project when I was 13. Shelby's Lady, a pedigreed pig. I had things like that, and I didn't have to get over anything, but it would make a beautiful book cover. And so the hogs and the chickens and the dogs named for movie stars. I don't know how to get out of this, but everything I started writing, probably close to 100%, is tinged with the culture I grew up in. That even includes tobacco. I never thought I could write about tobacco worms. You don't see any poems in poetry that has tobacco worms in it, but there might be a chance. But I don't try to do this, but that's what I come to now, and have for some time. And recently, another thing, and I'll stop talking, it always was there. The color line and the whole history from 1850 on. Across the road is my great-great-grandfather George. He died in 1886. He had 19 children and 2 wives. And I wondered if he farmed children, he and Penelope's niece Polly. And then came, of course, the invisible freedom of the slaves, 1865 and so on. But I came to that, so I had to go. Pat George sold a slave girl, 10 years old. And I thought, gosh, can I write about this? So eventually, saw this citation in my sister's hand. I went to the archives in Smithfield and saw that, a copy of the sale. And then I went to the courthouse and saw it again. And then I went to archives in Raleigh and saw it on microfilm. So I kept doing it anyway. That's what I keep coming to, not trying to reconstruct history, but to realize that we're beautifully imperfect.
Okay. Jackie, what brought you to this table today? How
Wow.
did you get started?
My husband drove me here.
Thank you, Abdul Latif.
Actually, and many of you have heard this story, I've never wanted to be a poet. Growing up, I never said I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be an oceanographer. But it was my father who reminded me that I did not know where the ocean lived, that I'd never been to the ocean, that I'd never seen an ocean, and in the near future would not be seeing an ocean. But it is my grandmother's story, the story of my grandmother's grandmother, that she would tell me as a child. My grandmother's grandmother was, and I know you've heard this recently, Paul, Sylvia, and dear friend, but you're going to hear it again. My grandmother's grandmother was the child of the white slaveholder who owned she and her mother. And this child lived in the big house with he and his family. She was the property of her 3-year-old half-sister, and it was her job to take care of this little girl, to make sure that she was clothed every day, that her hair was perfect. But the children, the white children, taught my grandmother's grandmother how to read and write. It was the children's secret. But because reading and writing was unlawful for a slave person, this child, when it was discovered that she could read and write, was severely beaten and thrown out of the house, sent to live at the edge of the fields with an old slave woman, and then she was sold several months later. The story is that my grandmother's mother was running behind the buck wagon that was taking this child away to the other plantation several counties away. And an old rusty nail fell from the buck wagon. My grandmother's mother picked up the nail and she kept the nail. So I write out of this container of what we keep keeps us. So it's my grandmother who told me, you will write, you will tell. This is what you will do. You will be a teacher. You will write, you will tell the story. Because someone who looked just like you almost died just to know how to read and write. I have the nail. The nail has been passed down through the matriarchal lineage of my family. In having the nail comes much responsibility to this whole notion of this landscape of writing. So I've been writing since I was a very, very young child. I didn't know that I was writing, but I called it my little books. And my grandmother would give me those little, she called them tablets. Y'all remember the tablets? But she would give me these little books to keep me quiet in church, and I would fill them up. And there would be stories about the women in hats on Sunday, or the humor with some elder who prayed the same prayer every Sunday in a very funny incantation that all the children mocked. But these stories, this container of writing from whence I enter, I write about who I am. I write about the people, the community, the country, the South that has birthed me. I also write about transition, not being in this country, not being in this state sometimes. But it's clearly a reference to the history and history that brings me to the page. And I realized as a child that my grandmother had really imprinted upon my psyche that I was going to write. It wasn't really a conscious decision, it happened. So my first poem was published by North Carolina Central University's literary journal called Exumbra. I think they still have it. But it was a poem that I wrote at 10, that my cousin, who was in college at NCCU, submitted under my name. They never questioned if I went there, and I think I had 3 published. So that was the beginning of my publishing career. And I too was a housewife who I wrote when the children slept. New England cold mornings, alone in New England without the South that I knew to keep me company or to direct and instruct my writing. So that's kind of my background. I've been writing for a very, very long time. And it's taken me a very, very long time in this culture to gather the permissions to say that I am a writer. It took me a long time. When people would ask me, what do you do? I'd say I'm a paralegal for Legal Services of North Carolina, where I'm the director of a community, social activist community center, but I would never say I'm a writer. So finally, after many, many years, I feel that I now have the self-validation to claim to be the writer.
Okay, I'm going to ask you all to indulge me just a little bit and also disagree.
Is that mic on?
Hello?
No,
Okay.
there's an easy way right there.
Hey, thanks, Paul. You must be a tech guy, right?
Jackie was in charge.
Okay.
Just got you. Okay.
Thanks. And you might disagree with this categorization of your work, but I was thinking about the differences. You know, here are three people who were inducted into the Hall of Fame this year, coming from different backgrounds and having very different stylistic concerns. And I'm going to actually read a little section of each of your poems, and then we're going to start with Jackie responding, going back this way since we started with you last time. It seems, you know, basically when I think of your poems, Betty, I think of the lyric, obviously, and they're rooted in beauty, but there's also often an undercurrent of sorrow or recognition that there's sorrow in the world, and despite the sorrow, you're not going to turn away from that beauty. And I was thinking, particularly at the beginning of this, Articles of Faith. There's another world, and it is this one, Paul Eluard. A spider set her wheel in the frame of our kitchen window, fragile and singular as a snowflake. An imperfect circular knowledge of light, of dew and shadow, its capture of purest brevity endures the span of one whole October 50 years ago. That's just the beginning of that poem. And Shelby, you know, when I think of your progression, and the other day at the gathering, you were reading from your first book, Fiddle Dee Dee, and your most recent book, Steal Away, and there was that love of language, a little more elegiac. But I think of you as really kind of dealing with your legacy. Both, you know, initially maybe the legacy of the land, and as you aged and matured, get into the legacy of family. And I was going to, and history. And I was going to read the beginning of the Tobacco Packhouse's grade and bench. We separated the bench into grades, ugly, bad, and good, and under our feet we made a pile for trash. What we never said was nothing rude. My father chewed right down to the ring of his Rum River crook. He talked to himself, dribbling smoke to make us see beyond dusk. We separated the bench into grades, ugly, bad, and good. And it's just the beginning of that. And when I think of your poetry, Jackie, starting from the earliest poems, Mask, you know, all the wonderful books you published, Carolina Wren Press, I think of you as having a stance in the world. And that's what you bring your poetry to, a stance as an individual, a stance as part of multiple communities, community of women, of course, Betty, you're the same, African Americans, as a person with a social conscience. And I'm going to read just the beginning of An Eclipse of Skin. 1, the blood was calling. 2, ancient spirits gather beneath erect feet, cry an ancestral anointment, kiss torn torso, restitch face to smile. 3, splintered hands hold death songs, one breath crawling towards light. Okay, do you think that's an accurate characterization of where you're writing from as a poet? And in a way, what we're really talking about is, what is poetry to you?
As a woman, as a Southern woman, as an African American Southern woman, breath is political. So breathing, showing up, is a political act for many of us. So I have always, I guess, I've always been the writer, but I've always been an activist, a community activist. I've worked all my life in social and human services, and people have wondered, well, how is it you have a master's in community economic development, which has nothing to do with poetry? But it has everything to do with poetry for me. So this notion of me being a cultural activist is, I think at this point of my life, it's not what directs my writing world or what informs me, but it is very difficult for me to wake up every day and show up and not be attuned and paying attention to the suffering and the pain and the evil and meanness in this world. It just does not work for me. So when I'm sitting looking at the trees in my backyard, I'm not only enjoying the landscape of this beautiful yard, but my mind is traveling, who possibly hung from that tree? Or who possibly hid in that brush? So herstory continues to just kind of plague my memory or my psyche that I must pay attention. So I'm always paying attention. And for me, I've stood for writing for the purpose of my writing being utilitarian. That a poem for me is a container for someone. It might be a container for someone to hold pain or grief or sufferance. When I lost my daughter 6 years ago to cancer, I did not write until recently, until last year. But I realize how poetry now has become the container for the telling that I can now do with the poems I want to write about her. So I don't know if I got off base from answering that, but.
Do you have a poem you'd like to read?
I'm going to read something because you asked us about influence. You know, what influences your writing. So yes, there are many, many writers I could talk about that influence my writing. But I come from this notion of the everydayness of writing, the everydayness of art. I come from a family where my ancestors were potters. They found red clay in Orange County and they made very beautiful, aesthetically beautiful pots that some of them are at UNC. But they made them because they needed them. They quilted because they needed to stay warm. My grandmother quilted every day, but she didn't quilt for the aesthetic of having it in a museum. It served a purpose. So this is a poem I wrote about something that happened to me as a child. And you can see it's still, I wrote it about 20 years ago. I don't think I've ever read it, but maybe once. So I'm going to try this out on you. So it's about a memory that I needed to somehow dismantle in a way. It is this woman thing stalking you, invited you outside. Choose your own weapons. They stood behind me in the checkout line. When my emerald turned up missing, I went straight to Aurelia. I don't care if she's been in my family for 2 generations. She's still the maid. The maid, you know how the maids are. I called Aurelia at home. Have you seen my emerald ring, Aurelia? Maybe the vacuum cleaner? It is this woman thing stalking you, inviting you outside. Choose your own weapons. My grandmother held legacies tied up in the corners of dusty handkerchiefs, dusty with snuff from her pockets. She held thread, needles, a missing button, a 4-leaf clover, a thimble. Her latest grandchild's first shed tooth, continuing to touch the little pearl tooth with her fingers, reminding the fingers to remember the tooth fairy. She held the one blonde strand of hair, the Kleenex with his semen. It is this woman thing stalking you, inviting you outside. Choose your own weapons. I was 10, my brother 7. We both saw her at the same time. Annie Oakley Pretty, Dale Evans Smile, Monroe Shimmer. She looked like a movie star. We followed her from aisle to aisle. What do movie star magazine women eat? What do they feed their little blonde children? She was confused. 6 cans of pork and beans, Vienna sausages, pork brains, sardines, alphabet ravioli, white rice, boxed potatoes. We figured she was buying these ugly foods for someone else. No one this pretty would ever buy such ugly food. Just as she sniffed the Thursday porgies, we were both in front of her buggy, smiling our most mannered smiles for strangers, when she started screaming, "Get these little niggas, get them, get these little niggas away from me!" My aunt came running from some aisle. She arrived to the scene first, probably coming from the baking section. She was always making cakes. Then the meat man ran out from behind the employees only, no entrance door. My mother was on top of her cart, throwing the pork and beans, pork brains, sardines, throwing the ugly food at the beautiful woman who forgot that she was beautiful, who forgot to remember to forget ugly words like nigger. It is this woman thing stalking you. No weapons. Choose your own grave. So as a piece I wrote this piece when I was probably 17. Because I kept going back to that memory, because I kept going back to that grocery store. And there would be something else that would happen. So this container of remembering to remember, and where does that memory, the container for these kind of memories, where do we store and dismantle? And when is it useful to bring it back for the retelling or the rewriting of it, if that makes sense?
Okay, good. Tell me, are you writing from legacy?
Legacy, you mean history in the past? And
History, personal history?
yeah, I was just thinking, yeah, but those local things, what I hope, you know, I think on the page I'm pretty doomed if there's no singing there, if there's no lyric or no feeling. Now, I don't know what poetry is, you can think of, but for me, it's an emotional kind of, legacy. I wouldn't do it if I were not drawn to it. You know, it's just what I didn't come to when I started, and
who were the poets that brought you to it?
the poets who brought me to it.
Who were the poets who sang to you?
Oh, I would read anyone. I mean, I fell in love with Shelley when I was about 25. I mean, I'd read him, but he would say things like, in defense of poetry, poetry is a sword forever unsheathed that would consume the scabbard that would contain it. And I thought, wow. Whitman, yeah. And I've read, I like the early Nicky Giovanni. I read, you know, Henry Dumas was a wonderful poet. He didn't live long, was killed. The singers, Lucille Clifton. I love to see I don't use the word vernacular, but I love to see somebody's talking. And I was saying to Sylvia coming in, as we were on the freeway there, blocked in by all the cars, Richard, and you were trying to bring us to this wonderful restaurant. Now, what did I say to Sylvia? What did I say, Sylvia? What?
You can make it up. Nobody was in
Music
it.
was for one thing.
Oh yeah, the music but I remember getting through school and never having to translate anything Eliot put in Italian anymore. I didn't feel intimidated, and then when I read Pound, I heard that he made a lot of those references up. But it all became personal to me. You're laughing, isn't that true, Betty? I mean,
I hope so.
I hope so too. But you don't have to be intimidated. And if I hadn't kind of opened up, the risk is, I guess, and I will end on this, and I hope it never happens to me. You know, we could hokey things up, and you know, being from whatever the South is, the good old boy and the good old girl. But I don't want to do that. But I grew up hearing the stories, and I know Betty did too. Help me out of this,
Wait,
Betty.
before we go to Betty, why don't you read something? Either
Yeah, you should
something,
read something.
something of yours or something of another writer you admire.
Well, I fell in love with Theodore Retke.
Okay.
I love Yes Says the Lamb, but I'll just read a thing at random here. This is from Her Becoming. All right, 4th stanza. Ask all the mice. I like Retke because I can see him in the greenhouse, among the cellars and roots and dirt. And the mice, the little animals, Richard. Ask all the mice who caper in the straw. I am benign in my own company, a shape without a shade, or almost none. I hum in pure vibration, like a saw. The grandeur of a crazy one alone, by swoops of bird, by leaps of fish, I live. My shadow steadies in a shifting stream. I live in air. The long light is my home. I dare caress the stones. So you hear the music? All that's internal. The field, my friend. A light wind rises. I become the wind. Stuff that a human being shouldn't be allowed to write.
Well, to agree. Is this stuff that people shouldn't be allowed to write?
Oh,
This type of lyric. Is it so beautiful?
No, I
that
mean,
we
it's
should
too
say
no,
good.
it?
it's too good to be true, perhaps, but the problem is that the beauty makes it true.
It's what?
The beauty makes it true.
Yeah.
And I do believe that.
Okay,
I've just had a big argument in Philadelphia with a former dean of humanities at Penn, who is a real intellectual, and he wanted
You had
to.
an argument?
Yeah, I had an incredible argument because he was, he's actually more of a theorist. He is an arts theorist, and he wanted to pin me down on, we can't do this, and art can't do that. Yeah, and I said, no. And more or less what I said to him was, the beauty makes it true. He says, there's no such thing as truth. I said, forget it, you know, because I know what I'm doing, you know. He knows what he's doing, I know what I'm doing, we're doing different things.
Words don't quite work, do they, Betty?
They don't work?
No, I mean, they work, but they find themselves. And I was thinking of Keats's line, truth is beauty, and your discussion here. Those are words we can't define. I'll be quiet.
No.
That's true, I suppose, but I wasn't intending to refer to Keats, so I obviously did do that.
But if we can't define them, you don't know if that's true.
I'm not having this argument again.
No.
I already went to the mat with a dean, for God's sake.
I defer.
So, but no, but I mean, I think that the language has in it what you want if you know how to find it. I mean, it's really sort of in there. It's a music that is in there,
Very
and it is also it's also a kind of way of getting at something you could not say otherwise. You could not say otherwise. And so that's sort of my take on it. And I don't remember what you said I did. But anyway, whatever it was, I'm sure it was true.
Well, let me just, you know, you just said it's a way of getting at something you can't get at otherwise. Was it William Stafford who also said poetry is an attempt to say in language what can't be said?
Exactly.
In words?
It is
Yes.
more precise than prose, whatever prose is.
Yes, it is
I
more.
think, you see.
It is more precise
It's
than
fine,
prose,
you
but
say.
it's also, I think about the woman, the feminist, there was a feminist scholar at my 50th high school reunion, believe it or not. Anyway, and she said, why did you go into poetry? Because the language is so, it's so wiggly, it doesn't hold anything, you know, I mean, why would you go into that? Because of course she's used to writing academic think, you know. And I said, because I want to work with the wiggle. Because that's exactly what I want, is words that can be sculpted, as it were, from each other and touch each other in ways that make a new shape. And that's what interests me. And I think and the great thing is that the benefit, the sort of extra, is the music, the sound, and what you get in doing that. So anyway, but is that?
Yeah, that sounds great to me.
Yeah.
You guys okay? That sounds good. All right. Do you have
Okay.
something you'd like to read?
Well, I thought I would just, I just sort of put this up at random here, but this is a poem that is set in my hometown. I do not write totally about my hometown. I do not write totally about the South. I do not write totally about, but it's always in there somewhere. And one of the things I do too sometimes is simply tell stories about people that I knew in that world. I come from a very, very tiny East Texas, deep East Texas town. They say deep East Texas because I think people might have drowned there, you know. And there were only 2,000 people, and I knew everybody, and everybody knew me. And there were all of the whole terrible things that happened in the South were there. The history was there. It was a strange combination of West and Deep South, which made it very odd in some ways. And but this is about someone that I knew, and all the white boys in San Augustine had double names. You know, Bill Tom, Joe Jim, you know, they all, Billy Bob, you know, they all had these double names. And there's one whom I remember particularly, and this is a true story. This is what happened to him. And it breaks my heart because he was a very special kid who was not good at athletics, not good at a lot of things, and was sort of the funny guy and so on. And I was very fond of him. At any rate, Joe Bill. Boys were given double names in Deep East Texas, where everything needed repeated force just to stand out, to be dragged out of the dark, the dense forests and rutted country roads. And these weren't nicknames, but were inscribed in the baptismal rolls of clapboard churches. Jimmy Clyde, Bill Tom, Herbert Jean. Like all of them, you grew into the heaviest jobs with the most to lose. Working the night shift, repairing downed lines one icy December, you grabbed with both hands the live lightning. What must it have been like to grasp like Prometheus the fire without the power to give it away? Was there a sudden shining of knowledge, something understood, or only the instant's slippage, swift swift as a wind-struck candle into night, before you could know the surge. The surgeon took both your hands. You'd been the boy who always smiled. Bulky, clumsy, no good at sports, and teased as such boys always are, but laughing to make up for what it was you weren't. When I saw you for the first time in 50 years, you hid the hooks, refused to eat in front of us. And when I reached to embrace you, no, you said, and would not let me touch you, and wouldn't smile. Later, I learned about your only son, a champion buckle-winning rodeo rider. He blew his brains out at 24 in Colorado. You, who had held on to so much power it should have killed you, had carried that current like the remnant of a god, and it had broken off as if a luminous spear had snapped inside you, leaving only a pitch-black permanence. The light and dark, unparted, doubled and doubled again until there was no light. There was no light at all. The last line is from a poem by Theodore Lefka. And the words "something understood" comes from one of George Herbert's definitions of prayer. So, but this is a true story. He lost his hands working electrical lines, and he lost his son. And I had to write that story. And the double names seemed necessary. So I don't know how I found the way to do the story, but that's what I needed to do. So it's partly about where I came from and partly about that place, but it's also about something a little beyond that.
Right, and it's about what is poetry. It's about, Shelby talked about poetry is more precise than prose, and I can guarantee probably a lot of people kind of went like this when you said that. And I was thinking of Betty's poem, the lines like grasp the fire without the power to give it away. The ending imagery of the light and dark doubling until there's only dark left. And that does seem more precise than prose, but why? Why is that more precise than the story that he told us?
I don't know why. I think Betty, I'm basically a storyteller, and words get in the way when I try to tell a story, Jackie can speak to this, I hope, better than I can. But I love the words and to be surprised when I'm telling the story. Joe Bill. And these images, and it helps, and doesn't, anesthetize the story, but my God, it brings alive this horrible thing if she just told a story and didn't use any images.
Figurative language.
Figurative language. I started to say metaphor, and every time I say that, I think of what's a metaphor. A cow can lie down in one, so I couldn't get to it.
Well, the story, you have the sequence of actions, you have the causality.
Yeah.
Okay, and you have the anecdote.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And you have the place, because I placed them
when you have
in Deep East Texas. Yeah.
Right, when you have the idea of fire that you don't have the power to give away, then you're talking about a different type of truth.
Yeah. Well, poetry brings us in. We can participate in the poem. It has possibilities, you see, for everyone.
You're going to have to give this to...
That's why it's precise.
Okay, and I want to ask Jackie about that. This poem, Betty's poem, even like a line, like everybody knows the Emily Dickinson poem, line, hope is a thing with feathers. Why is that true? Why is that the type of thing, that poetry can do, why is that more true than prose?
Because it wiggles you right into a bird.
Well, I think when the listener listens to Betty's poem, that there are key words that jump out of you, and you're not only hearing the language, because she has an incredibly wondrous way of economizing with language, of giving only what is strong and poignant and directs. And she directs us to feel the landscape of, there's some layered emotions in that piece. I mean, there's the loss of the hands, the loss of the son, the loss of the friendship, the loss of him pushing you away. And that's what figurative language does when you're skilled enough to master that way of presenting. There are many stories that I want to tell, but I struggle with them. Like I said, this piece was written at 18. I never edited it. I never looked at it again. It needed to be told. I needed to tell it. And I think in this culture, one of the things we get caught up in is deciding who gets to validate us as writers. And, who gets to say, this poem is better than that poem. So I think when people are seriously writing, that there is room enough for many landscapes of hearing and writing poetry. So when I'm writing with differently literate writers and incarcerated writers like Rich has worked with for years, that it's very, very important to not to disenfranchise the messenger. And this culture will do this if we are not very, very careful, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ben?
Well, I think it's interesting that children quite naturally use figurative language because they don't have the abstractions yet that we substitute for that. So I think about and some of you will have heard this story before, but it's just one that sticks with me, that my next door neighbor had her little girl who was about 4 or 5 came over one day, and it was February, it was gray, it was miserable. We had a few of those, you remember. And she said, this day is like the ghost of a snowball. The ghost of a snowball. This child said this. And I thought, I want that, and children do. And my daughter, when she was about the same age, was being carried into the car from having been with us at the state fair. And she was asleep on her father's shoulder, but she looked up and she said, Daddy, the moon is broken. It was, a half moon thing. And I thought, this is figurative. This is what we actually are made to speak experience, not just to speak something that refers to experience. We're made to speak experience too, because children do it. So anyway.
And as someone who works with kids, the beauty of that is you can steal those ideas and they won't remember them.
I know.
How long? Shift gears a little bit.
Turn it back.
All right. How long does it take you to write and revise a poem?
Wow. A long time. So there are some poems that I work on, I revise them 4 or 5 times, and then they end up pretty much back to being the original. And then there are pieces that there's one poem in Breath of the Song that I revised. I worked on this poem, at least 14 different versions of it. Even though my editor kept saying, it's fine, it's fine. I was saying, it's not fine, it's not ready. And then it was ready. And then there are some pieces when Rich and I were working on this book, when he was like, no, it's done, let it be. And I've learned to trust his editorialship and good editors. But for me, it's a process. That's why I don't have tons of books. We live in a culture where I have friends that it seems like every quarter they have 2 books. They have books. They're just publishing. But it takes me a long time to, I have lots of manuscripts, but they're not ready, and I know they're not ready, and I want them to be ready. So for me, it's a different, depends on the work. It depends on the work and sort of where the poem is being birthed from. Decides a lot, has a lot to do with the outcome of it being ready.
Betty, and then we'll go to Shelby.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I don't want to get too pointed here. I don't think one can do it alone. I just don't know. I would pour this stuff out, when I came to it. And these leaves would be lying around and she'd read it. And I found out anything that was kind of local, specific, or had details could live, and I wanted to make that sing. And now she's no longer doing that. So I've got to look at things, and I've mentioned this to Deborah and others. And I don't know, Jackie, you and Betty, if you have someone who reads your things, you can't do it by yourself. And I think, Richard, who this was a pretty recent manuscript, Steal Away, when Richard read it. And it was kind of a different manuscript. It's not a riff. I'm trying to find some freedom within constricted spaces and forms, and that might not be what I should do. But on the other hand, I'd love to bring Doggerel back, because I loved it when I was growing up. And nobody knows. We're talking about, think of the poets and writers who aren't remembered, starting with Emily, and Hope is the Thing with Feathers, and Wadsworth Longfellow was the bard of the time. Or you think of, in fiction, Melville, whose name was misspelled in his obituary, and you can go on with this. I don't think the public knows very much. I'm not sure how much we know. Betty?
Well,
do you have someone to read your work?
no, Don and I were married for 54 years.
Wow.
Tomorrow is the anniversary of his death, 4 years. And he read everything that I ever did, but he never, ever made a suggestion or cut this. He would say, what's that mean? And then I would say it again. And he would say, but you just said it. You didn't tell me what it means. And I said, that's what it means. We used to have this little battle going on. But no, he loved poetry. And he loved my poetry. And he would say sometimes, I think that's a little too long. I think that poem's a little too long. And I would go back and say, okay, where can I trim this, But he never did any kind of editorial thing at all. Because, for one thing, I wouldn't have let him. I'm mean about that. But I rewrite tremendously.
After it gets cold?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't sit down and write until something comes and is finished. I don't do that. I have had poems I've worked on for 10 years. Particularly the first long poem I ever wrote, because I couldn't do it. But at the time that I visualized it and imagined it, I didn't have the skills to do it. So I had to keep working on it until I made myself have the skills to do it. But it's plain work. And I sometimes revise as many as 30, 40, 50, 60 times. Now, I don't revise the whole thing, no. But I'm changing this line. I'm changing that one. I found a line break that is better than the one I've got. I found a punctuation thing. I think I want to use it. I like dashes when they're appropriate, and I'll see something and I'll think that would be better with a dash than with a period in another new sentence. And I work that way, and all of it is, the problem is that every single thing in a poem is important. Every single thing. It's like watchmaking. It is not like, painting a wall. It's hard. It's hard. And who knows why anybody would do it. Okay.
Well, okay, I have a
Yeah.
question.
I mean, you guys are roughly my age. Can you write with a word processor, or do you need a pencil and a legal pad? When I write something, I need a pencil and a legal pad. I'm just curious, can you guys?
I write all my first drafts out in longhand. And then I go and sit and I sit in a different chair. Then I go sit at the computer and type it into the computer and look at it, and I'm making changes while I'm doing that. And then I print it out and I go sit in that other chair. I leave that computer and take the pen with me. And that's how I work. And it goes back and forth and back, well, who knows how many times. You know. And then toward the end, I'm just making little tiny changes. So it stays on the computer and I just X out the comma and put in the, whatever I'm doing, you know.
Right. As an editor, that's
You
what
can't kill it if it's going to live. That's right.
as an editor, that's what I find the better poets do. What it's, and this is a generalization, so it's not always true, but often the people who are just painting the wall sit down and type it out in the morning. You know, that whole process, I think, writing by hand, printing it out, revising it, typing it out, it allows you, at least from people I've seen, it allows them to have more time to reflect and revise, whereas if you just sit at a screen and type it up, you know, you can type faster than you can write in longhand. So you miss an initial revision stage. You know, whereas if you're writing in longhand, you're already into the editing process, you know, and revision process, whereas you can like skim through a draft of a poem pretty quickly if you're just typing it up.
I do basically exactly what Betty does. I guess I should own stock in legal pads. But I do. I have my favorite pens and my favorite paper. It's got to be the right kind of paper. I have hundreds of journals. So I'm working on a collection of a body of work right now, and it's in this particular journal. I decided, and it's a beautiful journal, and that's where this work begins. But I do, the computer for me is where I edit, but it's like a storage place, and that's all. And I find now I go back to the computer and I do all my editing there. But I don't throw away, I used to throw away those legal pads. And now I don't throw them away, I keep them. But I used to throw them away. I was like, okay, it's done now, I can throw it out. But that's the only way I can write. I have never sat at the computer and composed. I mean, I've never gone to the computer and say, I'm writing today. It's all in my journal. And I'm like Betty, I move around. The computer and the study is only for the work of it. Sitting in bed or on the deck or the porch is for the writing, the making of it, or, you know, or wherever I am. But different landscapes for me.
Shelley?
Gosh, I can write anywhere, usually in the morning. I just regular paper, like Blue Horse things in a notebook, and I type it up right away, because if I wait, I can't read my writing. And I print it out, and I live with it. I've got manuscripts lying around, believe me. And gosh,
I've seen them.
they have to get cold. And I've got a 300-page, I guess it's a memoir, hybrid poem, prose. Now, who's going to publish that? Anyway, see, but I'm doing this because I guess I have to do it, and I really don't think about publication, I guess, and I should, Betty.
Why?
Well,
It will follow if you do it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So somebody's going to, yeah, okay.
Well, you may have to cut it.
Or do it in two parts. It goes from A to Z. It's called Country, and basically it's about probably music. It's about me. It's about why I didn't go to Nashville, but it's poetic.
I think that sounds very interesting. I suggest you finish it.
Who's going to read it? Okay.
Me, for one.
Okay.
You don't have to take that.
Oh, you've got one.
Would you guys like to read a poem? I'd like to. You guys want to hear a poem? Let's hear it.
Yes, yeah.
Why don't each of you read either one of your own or something you like?
Okay.
I'd like to hear you, Betty.
Uh,
Jackie, would you like to hear
Jackie, let Jackie read first.
Betty? Let Jackie read
Let
first.
Jackie read first. Because I don't know what I'm going to read. I don't know what I brought.
I could read one of yours. Oh.
I'm going to read a poem that I wrote for Shelby
Oh.
that he's never heard.
Well, I don't have the one I wrote for you.
Oh, shucks. Buried Kinships, a poem for Shelby. How long does it take to name everything you've ever known and loved? July, a slave girl, a tonic of wisteria, black widow web. She is the book we're lifting together from a communal chef of washed southern ground. She is the book we read together, potion for forgiveness, pouring from the tips of her fingers. July, the early morning lesson for all our sons.
Gosh, thank you, Jackie. Beautiful.
Okay, let you read one.
Okay, Shelby,
Hmm?
would you like to read one?
Yeah. I better not look for the poem I wrote about Jackie. It may be too drafty, but if it falls out, the one I wrote for Betty is.
This is the glamorous work of the poet.
I
You
wrote.
wrote a poem for me?
I did. It's not ready. I wrote entries on all the Literary Hall of Famers.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't done that. I've got to write something about you guys.
Oh, shucks, Jackie. Okay, can't find it. Hmm? Okay, can't do it. What am I going to read, Richard?
Anything you want.
Okay, hey, here's one that's not quite a story. And this may come from the, I was reading John Ashbery years ago. I'll read this, and I'll read from Steal Away in a minute. Maybe I'll get a chance. Here's one for the hummingbirds. Balm, B-A-L-M. The rain has swollen the cloudy singing and hidden hums. The ruby throats to the feeder come, hunkered over watery shadows. Okay? Maybe this is not, it's not a story, I guess, but I'd like to read this. It's called Recognition. I'm an ordinary man. I am with you in the shade. I feel the edge of lying back against the bark, and I view the shaking sun on the lake, the lay of the horizon. My frayed feelings swell and swallow up the least utterance, reaching out where the road and the water move together. The relating debris scatters enough tiny reckonings to force off a remembrance of tomorrows, the clouds of the brows, a meeting of blue eyes, thighs, the setting sun, and the grimace on the runner's face when she trips and falls. What is an elegy but the going for the finish line that begins the race again? The resistances come out willingly. I was dreaming of getting someplace and looking back and saying, this is it. But no, that's just the way the cast light plays the tin roof. Lays corners smooth as spheres or the slender reaches of dissimilarity. Why can't I put simple pleasures in the world using ticky-tacky, an August ice sail, say, a leaf slipping down to roll the dust imperceptibly, a scraggly attempt at the end of the road, a detour to establish a reality of things with the knowledge that the words I should have said long ago I have not said and cannot, Lord, cannot. We brush and sweat, wash and wet our bloom. We enter that part of ourselves, cast aside to drift. There, doubt settles. There, our splendor goes unnoticed, for we are a scanty piece that stretches into regions where the spirit and the body are one, and the tomatoes on the vine wait to be picked and eaten. I want to become a plain and let your crop grow in my approaches to the weather. But I cannot account for the purpose of the simple life I did not choose. You have some idea of my revival, but I cannot tell you to what extent my bones ache in the curve, a jar in the arm resting comfortably on the sofa. That you will understand is my wish, if only for a moment, when my hands lie in my lap like dried okra.
Betty?
Well, I'm going to read this one. It came out in Virginia Quarterly Review some time ago. Why white Southern poets write the way we do. Because we were the last ones deserted by the god of visions and serpents. Because an August field can levitate on the ratcheting din of cicadas. And the magnolia offering its melted candles burns invisible prayers onto sunlight. Because every one of us has at least one relative who plowed poor with a mule. Because the dead still enter our sleep as columns of figures on the debit side of the ledger. And there are darker voices in which we cannot speak. Black ghosts, smoke hanging in the twilit live oaks. Because we found the broken words everywhere, rolling like loose beads under the chiffonier. And we weren't suspicious when our breath restrung them in patterns heavy as scripture. Because a mist can sit on a pasture like a cloud in a basket. And we never stopped believing the hoop snake was real and does roll to assert the compass of time, framing the vanished, the exiled dreamers, even ourselves rising to occasion, almost reprieved as the weed-strangled fields rise in autumn fire to dance, to sing anyhow, to grieve.
That's wonderful, Betty.
One more, okay, I'm gonna ask one more question.
Is that in the book?
I'm gonna ask one more question of the panel. And they do have books back there if you're welcome to look. And also, I have samples of J.K. Press books. This is not a high sales job type of thing, but feel free to look at the books. Age. 2 years ago, you guys are all in the Literary Hall of Fame now. And people want you. Can you come here? Can you read here? Can you talk here? 2 years ago, you weren't in the Literary Hall of Fame. You were just kind of poets from another generation to a lot of people coming up. Is there a prejudice against older poets in this state?
Against whom?
Older poets.
I'm not sure there's a prejudice against older poets in the state. We've talked about this before. I think there are a lot of cliques. The literary scene has changed. 2011, I was very, very ill of a chronic illness. So from 2011 until pretty much last year, I was off the scene. But before I left the scene, I was as in demand as I am now. Maybe not 3 or 4 times a week, but I was traveling, I was doing my work, I was invited to all the conferences, but there's just like this rapid growth, and I don't have anything against open mics and people who self-publish and spoken word, but again, this comes back to validation. So I just think there are just more people out here calling themselves writers and poets than ever before. And there's a lot of game. There's a lot of hustle. And there's a lot of really crap. There's a lot of crap. But a lot of the crap is getting a lot of recognition and celebration. So I'm not sure I don't know if it's age. I play on so many different fronts with so many different types of writers. But I know what the question is you're asking. So yes, to a certain extent, but then there are people older than me and who are my contemporaries who are still very, very celebrated. All we have to do is look at Hillsborough, where our dear friends live, and Hillsborough is kind of the planet of writing in the state to a certain degree. There are a lot of writers in one area, and they're our age. Most of them are. So it's a hard question. I'm not sure what's happening, except I just think that there's so much more accessibility to poetry and to poets, and people are coming forth and I celebrate the new coming forth of new voices. I mean, I've stood for this all my life, that voices of many, many people are heard, and that we not, we not create a culture where those writers don't feel like they can emerge. But I think it's really unfair when some of us do the due diligence and the celebration goes to people for political reasons.
Okay.
And I think you know what I'm talking about.
Okay, I'm to be as honest as I can be. I'm just happy to know Jackie, to know Betty, to be part of all the flurry of words and music that salvaged my life and gave me and brought me this far. So I don't think of being left out when I'm looking at the page, and I really don't. Now, I subscribe to poetry, and I don't know too many. I mean, I've never heard. I mean, Jackie mentions, I agree with everything she said. I don't know these people, and I read the poems, and they're fine. In my defense, I've not seen any poems that have tobacco so far, or worms, or I don't know. But yeah, I'm just happy to be here. It's just wonderful. And the proliferation of MFA programs, of just go on and on and on. And my view is the more the merrier. I need all the help I can get, and gosh, let's have them. As far as whatever the politics and the inness and outness of it, it doesn't bother me as long as I get a little sleep. I really don't think about it.
I don't need it. Well, I think Jackie mentioned there are a lot of people, enormous numbers of people calling themselves poets. I think that there's a clue there in a sense, because you actually have to earn that. You don't get to just say it in my book. It's hard work, and it takes time, and it takes more than a degree in it, too. A lot more. I have heard some people say that, you know, that they published a book a year. Well, that's too many. You didn't call, you didn't edit, you didn't look. So, you know, I publish a book about every 5 to 8 years. And that's my pace. And I probably won't, I'm finishing up a full-length book now, and it's probably my last one. So that's okay. It's for me, it's slow food, it's slow work. It's meant to be savored in a different way. It's not, for me, it's not performance, it's not entertainment, it's not preaching, it's not dancing, it is poetry, and it is hard. Okay?
You know, the name Amy Clampett just came to me. She started publishing, she must have been close to 70.
She was in her 70s.
Yeah, and she's not with us. But there you go. I don't know why she didn't, but Jackie.
Yeah, I just want to say one last thing, and this is something that people often ask me about. So publishing has never been a big deal for me. I am very happy and I feel blessed and honored and humbled that my work has an audience. But I write because I have to write. I write because I don't know what else to do. You know, I found a journal, and I'd forgotten this. I kept a journal every day from the day we found out my daughter had been diagnosed with cancer. I started that day. And I forgot, and I don't know how I forgot this, but I found this journal the other day, and I'd written in it from that moment up until her burial. And it's some good writing there. I don't know if I will ever publish what's written there. There's some really, I think, there's some bones for some good pieces to come from that. But everything I write is not for consumption, it's not to be published. So I'm blessed to be published, but I just, you know, my hands are crippled. And the biggest challenge lying in that hospital bed was thinking, I won't be able to write. Not will I be able to get out of the wheelchair and walk, but it was like, I won't be able to write because this is what I do. So I will never stop writing. Betty will never stop writing, even though she says this is her last book. But it might be the last book, but it's not the last writing.
The last poem, that's right.
Right, and I believe that we are always writing poetry, that even when we're not scribing, you know, we're writing poetry. I'm writing poetry when I'm chopping vegetables, now that I can chop them.
Be written.
Yes.
You know, it's all around us.
Exactly. So it's here, and I'm never going to stop writing. And I'm like Betty, and I'm like Shelby. I really don't kind of care what's going on over there, except when it kind of encroaches in my space, and I'm very territorial if it like comes into my space and wants to eat up my poems. That's a whole other thing. But I think that most people who are very, very serious know that it's serious business, and when I'm teaching or when I'm running around doing this, I'm not writing. So there are times in my life when I have to say, thank you for the invitations, but this year I'm working on a manuscript, so I'm not accepting any public speaking events. I have to write. Because if we don't say that, we never get to write. I mean, maybe some people can be off and on planes and in and out of cars, but I'm not writing when I'm doing that, when I'm on. So I think the true writer stops for a minute and just, you have to be still and just be still and just be, because the poems are there and sometimes they find me. I don't have to go find them, they come to me. So I just wanted to kind of say that in reference to something Betty said, that the publishing is kind of the gravy. You know, the writing is as essential for me as breath.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for coming. And thank you for Joanne,